There we go. Okay, we are in chapter 4. Pirkei Avos chapter 4. And today we're looking at Mishnah number Tes, Mishnah 9. Now, I think this is one of those classic Mishnahs where at face value you look at it and say, okay, I get it. It's not very long and it's not very complicated. So how much are we going to be able to derive out of this Mishnah? That's why I say it's a classic. If you really want to appreciate what Pirkei Avos is all about, it's the depth that lies in what appears to be simple messages. So let's learn the Mishnah first, and then we'll break it up into 2 points. We'll analyze those 2 parts, and then we'll come back to the first part, because that's actually the first part that may potentially carry the deepest message of all out of this Mishnah. This Mishnah firstly is attributed to a rabbi called Rabbi Yonasan. So, okay, I don't assume that everybody necessarily keeps tabs on how often a rabbi is mentioned in the Mishnah. But let's just take a guess. Out of all the rabbis that you know from the Mishnah, how popular is Rabbi Yonasan? How often do you hear of him? Right? Not very often. It's not a Rabbi Akiva or a Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Gamliel. So who is this person? That's what we'll have to analyze at first. Let's see what he says. We'll come back, we'll find out who he is, and then we'll try and understand at least some of the depth of what Rabbi Yonasan has to teach us. So Rabbi Yonasan Oimer. Rabbi Yonasan says 2 principles. Principle number 1. Kol hamekayem es haTorah mei oini. Any person who upholds the Torah in a state of poverty, soifa lekaimo mei oisher, will eventually be in a position to uphold the Torah from a position of wealth. And then the second part of the Mishnah is the corollary. V'chol hamevatel es haTorah mei oisher, and any person who ignores the Torah in a state of wealth, soifa levatlo mei oini, will eventually be in a position to ignore the Torah because of the difficulties of poverty. Straightforward, right? So it's really simple. If a person is dedicated to Torah in the difficult times, Hashem will give them the opportunity for better times. And if a person becomes apathetic in the good times, then Hashem might take those good times from them. It's a straightforward Mishnah, right? All right. Straight away, you should have a whole series of questions in your mind. Like, for example, I'm sure I know somebody who is the exception to that rule. And even if it's not somebody who I know in a contemporary sense, certainly historically there must be people who are the exception to that rule. I don't know, let's just think somebody like Rabbi Hanina ben Doiso, who was probably one of the greatest sages that we know of, and was always dirt poor. So where did that happen? He was Mekayim, he upheld the Torah in a state of poverty, and doesn't seem that it necessarily worked out for him to eventually reach the state of wealth. So we have to analyze that. But before we do anything, let's just get a background on who the rabbi is, the Tana of our Mishnah. Just a little bit of an insight. Once we know who we're dealing with, it will also help us just to have some perspective. So the reason that you haven't really heard much about Rabbi Yonasan in the Mishnah is for a very good reason, because this is the only time that he's mentioned. Okay, now, he must be a great rabbi if he was mentioned, so where's the rest of his teachings? Here's an interesting piece of history. And I think what's often fascinating about learning Mishnah or learning Gemara is when you know the history of what was going on at the time, it really helps to appreciate the context of why people say the things that they do, or in this particular case, why rabbis mention so infrequently. So everybody remembers, I'm sure you remember, that at the time of the Roman attack and occupation of Israel, there were various stages of the conquest. Everybody pays a lot of attention, obviously, to the fact that they besieged and eventually destroyed Yerushalayim. We know that, and of course that led to Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So we know that. It's a really big part of our history. A very sad part of our history, but a big part of our history. There was another major event that also occurred some years later on Tisha B'Av that had a massive impact on the Jewish situation in Israel. Anybody remember what that was? Beitar, right? The conquest of the city of Beitar. And people don't realize, the Gemara describes Beitar was this very thriving society. It was dynamic. There were many, many people who were killed in the attack on Beitar. And it was a terrible disaster. And remember, they didn't allow them to bury their dead. It was part of the insult to injury. So Rabbi Yonasan lived in Beitar. And he was a student of a very famous Tana called Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yonasan was the student of Rabbi Yishmael living in Beitar. And when the conquest of Beitar happened, he ran away like everybody else did. And he landed up in a city called Hutzal. Now, occasionally in the Gemara, you find the name Hutzal. It's a place that developed as one of the secondary centers of Jewish learning after the Roman incursions. With an H. Hutzal. So he lands up, Rabbi Yonasan lands up in Hutzal. Now, a little bit of character. We don't know a lot about his character, but just a little bit of the character of Rabbi Yonasan is we know that he was an individual who was impeccable about honesty, to the extreme. So the Gemara tells the story that there was once a case with a woman who had a particular court case that was going to come in front of Rabbi Yonasan, and unrelated and not even intentionally, she brought him a basket of figs. And Rabbi Yonasan insisted he wouldn't take the basket, but not only that, he insisted that she take the basket away in exactly the same format that she brought it. So not only that none of the figs should remain behind, but almost as if, with the same enthusiasm. She should remove it with the same enthusiasm as she brought it, because he was so impeccably honest and he didn't want in any, even extreme sense, to be accused of bribery, of accepting a bribe. So we know that he had this impeccable integrity. That's what we know about him. And we know that he was a student of Rabbi Yishmael, and we know that he moved to this place called Hutzal. That's about as much biographical information as we have. So, a couple other details here and there, but this is significant to us because Rabbi Yishmael is responsible for one of the most important books or works of that time in history. So here's an interesting thing. Outside of the Mishnah, which other books were produced at that time? Okay, this is now a more difficult question, right? Which other books were produced at the same time? And when I say the same time, it's obviously over a number of generations. But as the Mishnah was being developed, what else was being developed alongside the Mishnah? So generally speaking, you could say that there were three channels of Judaism that were all being developed simultaneously. The legal side of Judaism in the Mishnah, which eventually would then be expounded on in the Gemara. The Midrashic interpretation of the Chumash and of the prophets. And the Kabbalistic in the Zohar. Okay, so those are the three channels that were working at that time. Now the thing is this, when we think about the Midrash, how do we think about the Midrash? How do we think about the Midrash? We think about, some people think about the Midrash says. Right? When you think about the Midrash. It's a nice multicolored book, set of books that you keep on your bookshelf, and it's got nice and interesting things to read on the Parasha of the week. The truth is that the Midrash is also not homogeneous. There are various books of Midrash. And some of it is very deep. Very deep. In fact, stylistically, I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but stylistically, the Midrash is more similar to the Zohar in style than it is possibly to the Mishnah in style. Fascinating. Very deep and profound stuff. So you know the Midrash, right? So you know, for example, that there is what we call the Midrash Rabbah. It's probably the best known of the Midrashim, and it's divided into the sections, Bereshis Rabbah, Shmois Rabbah, then it's on the Megillas, so you have Esther Rabbah, and etc. Right? That's how it's written. We also know that there's a Midrash attributed to a sage called Rabbi Tanchuma. It's called the Midrash Tanchuma. But then if you've ever read the Rambam's introduction to his 14-volume Yad HaChazaka, his Mishnah Torah, so he also speaks over there about books called the Sifra and the Sifri and the Mechilta. The Mechilta is the Midrashic work that was composed by Rabbi Yishmael and his students. And it's kind of a blend of Midrash Halacha. So it's, in a sense, the more legalistic side of the Midrash. And Rabbi Yonasan was one of the chief editors of that work. So although it's Rabbi Yishmael's work, Rabbi Yonasan is the one who is quoted most often in the Mechilta. So that's why you haven't encountered him. Because we tend to learn Mishnah much more than we tend to learn Mechilta. But if you would study the Mechilta, you would find Rabbi Yonasan's name a lot more frequently. So that's just useful for us to know. He was definitely a scholar of note, just not necessarily in the realm that we typically spend our time in. Okay, so that's our introduction. Now let's understand what is his message. Because on the face of it, his message is quite simply. If you can, as they say, fussbait, right? If you can hold on in the difficult times and remain committed to studying Torah, then he kind of promises you everything's going to work out in the end. So who comes to mind as an example of exactly that? Who would be the prime example? There's probably more than one. The prime example of somebody who really was mekayem. Now remember, the words he says over here, he doesn't say somebody who is loy-made, somebody who learns Torah. He says mekayem, which means to uphold the Torah, that implies something more than just simply learning. So who would come to mind as an individual who upheld Torah under extreme duress, financial distress, and then subsequently was in a position that they were blessed to actually fulfill the Torah in a position of wealth? Anybody come to mind? Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva is an interesting story, right? Why is Rabbi Akiva an interesting story? Because Rabbi Akiva, let's remember, the reason that Rabbi Akiva was destitute was because he didn't want to learn Torah. That's actually how he ended up being destitute. Remember the story? This is the shidduch crisis of that period in time. Or I don't know if it was a crisis as much as a scandal. So here you've got this person, this incredibly wealthy, respected individual, Ben Kalba Savour, at least that was his nickname. And everybody looks up to him. And Nebuch, the poor guy, his daughter, who's an absolute chap, lands up running off with the shepherd. It's not so simple, right? So then the father, Ben Kalba Savour, says, "That's it. I'm cutting your credit line." You know, that's she was obviously a girl who lived in the lap of luxury, and it was completely cut off. And the Gemara tells, it's actually interesting that the Gemara gets into this level of detail. The Gemara describes a story of how they had to sleep on straw, and it's bizarre that the Gemara says next, Rabbi Akiva was picking the straw out of his wife's hair. Like, why on earth are you telling us this information? And saying to her, don't worry, one day I will buy you an ir shel zahav, which was a tradition in those times. It was a tiara, a golden tiara, with the profile of Yerushalayim on it. He promised her that he'd buy her one of those. And of course, as we well know, Rachel got Rabbi Akiva to go and learn. So, yes, technically he was destitute at the time that he went to learn Torah, but ironically, he was destitute because of not learning Torah, actually. And then at some point in the future, years down the line, when he had his 24,000 students, he honored his promise and he bought her that Ir Shel Zahav. So there's a good example, a classic example of rags to riches in the context of learning Torah. Who else comes to mind? Okay, the one I thought you were going to say, which the Gemara says, Hillel Mechayev Aniyim. It's a fascinating Gemara. The Gemara says, you know, the nature of people is that we always have excuses. I think that's part of what Rabbi Yonasan is saying. People tend to have excuses. It's phenomenal how many excuses the human mind can generate at any given point in time. So, for example, I was at a bas mitzvah on Motzei Shabbos. So it wasn't necessarily a Haredi bas mitzvah, okay? So it was a little different perhaps to what we're used to. You know, a lot of music and people dancing and the whole thing. There's certain points where, you know, I couldn't really be around. So somebody comes to me afterwards and I said to them, tell me something. Are you insisting that your employees come back to work? I said, of course. Because look at this. If everybody can be dancing like this, they certainly can come back to work. So I said, so you're coming to shul? The human mind is incredible at generating excuses, right? So it was fascinating over this period, this last 2 years. It's been fascinating how people came up with reasons why. I don't know if it's safe. I don't know if it's safe to go to shul. I don't know if it's safe to go to a shir. But, you know, we're hanging out in Clifton or wherever it is. It's fascinating. So perhaps that's part of what Rabbi Yonasan is telling us, that if a person's going to have excuses, they're not going to get anywhere. And there's the excuse of wealth and there's the excuse of poverty. So the Gemara says a similar thing. Gemara in Yuma tells us that Hillel mechayev es ha'aniyim. Any person who has the excuse that I can't learn Torah because I'm destitute and I'm financially struggling, we say, oh, worse than Hillel? Remember, everybody knows the story of Hillel. Hillel lived at a time where you had to pay to go to Shiurim. Can you imagine such a thing? So he paid at a time, in order to get into the yeshiva, you had to pay. And he used to go chop and sell firewood, and that's how he had enough money, a little bit to eat, a little bit to get into the yeshiva. And famously, one day he didn't have enough money. They wouldn't allow him into the yeshiva, and he climbed up onto the skylight and he eavesdropped onto the shir. And they only discovered him the next morning, and then they realized how much he was willing to sacrifice for his learning. And he was then given free pass to come and study from then on. So we know that Hillel studied when he was poor. What happened to Hillel in the end? Hillel became the Nasi. Now, the Nasi is an intriguing position because the Nasi is a spiritual leadership position, but in a certain respect, it's also a general communal leadership position. And one of the things the Torah teaches us is that when a person is in a position of leadership, the Torah tells us this about a Kohen Gadol, HaKohen HaGadol Me'echav. So the Pasuk says, the Kohen who is greater than his peers, and then is anointed with oil, etc., etc., these are the jobs that he has. The Gemara says, HaKohen HaGadol Me'echav. If the Kohen Gadol is not wealthy, then it's the responsibility of his peers to give him wealth, because a leader should be in a position of wealth so that they're respected by the community. So the Nasi, in order to be the Nasi, the community had to pay all kinds of dues so that he could live a wealthy lifestyle. So you get Hillel, who went from the one extreme to the other extreme. And that would fit directly with Rabbi Yonasson's message over here, that if a person says they cannot fulfill Torah from a position of poverty, we say, such an excuse. Even in a position of wealth, you'll be the same. That's the message. It's not necessarily just a guarantee. It's effectively saying the person who is committed to do what they're supposed to do in the difficult times will remain committed in the good times, which automatically tells you something fascinating about human psychology, besides the fact that we're good at producing excuses. Here's the fascinating thing about human psychology. When is it easier to do what's right? Not when life is easy. That's the fascinating part of all of this. So a great illustration which we can all relate to would be, if you remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed and refuseniks came out of Russia, and many of them went to Israel. There were quite a number of Russians who came to this country. They didn't really build a community here as in other places in the world. And it was really fascinating to watch. I don't know if you saw, there was an article that was doing the rounds. If you're on the same WhatsApp groups that I am, you're going to get all these things a million times. So last week there was an article doing the rounds about the camels. Did you see the one about the camels? I don't know if it's true or not, but effectively it's this, I think it's a fiction, but it's attributed to the Emir of Dubai or whoever it is, who says, your great-grandparents rode on camels, and then your parents drove a car and you fly in a jet. What do you see your grandchildren using as their mode of transport? And he says camels. And they say, why? And he says something which is very insightful. He says, because those generations up until now, they realized how hard they had to work for these luxuries because they didn't take it for granted. So because of that, they had a very strong work ethic, and that's why they continued to progress. But the moment a society hits a point where there's a tremendous amount of extravagance and luxury around, then they lose that need to work, and then other people eventually become dominant and their society begins to decline. So effectively, that's part of what Rabbi Yonasson is saying over here. If a person has the tenacity during the difficult times when they are poor, that's the kind of person you can expect to sustain their spirituality when times are good. Now, he doesn't speak on the other side of it in the same order of events, but the message is the same. A person who cannot be dedicated to their values when times are good will certainly not be able to keep those values when times are difficult. It is incredibly not only profound, but relevant. He could have been speaking directly to us in our 21st century life, where, let's be honest, convenience is the thing. In a society where you can think about how many things we could do like this, it gets you into a headspace where you believe everything should be that way. So, for example, you want food, what do? I don't know, you call Uber Eats and they can even deliver kosher product and it's fantastic. Worst scenario, you pop something into the microwave. I think one of the things that depressed so many of us during the whole lockdown period was the fact that you can't just book a ticket and travel. We became so used to that. Now take a time machine back 200 years ago and ask, how frequently would a person have gone on a long haul journey in their lives? And the answer may be never. We're all nose out of joint because we can't pop onto a plane and just fly overseas at the drop of a hat. So we're living in this instant society, and as a result of that, we expect that everything will be instant. And the other night, I had a very interesting conversation with somebody about exactly this. And lately, wherever I go, I've been asking people, what's the one thing that you feel people are most lacking in their lives? And it's fascinating to see the answers that come back and how many people say common sense. But so I was having this conversation with somebody, and eventually we reached a point through the course of our conversation that we both concluded that what people are most lacking in their lives is a sense of peace of mind. So immediately they said to me, so how do you get it? There's the problem. If you live in an environment where you expect that everything is a download, so you don't realize that you actually have to work at things, if you don't realize that you have to work at things, if you don't realize that there is a state of poverty wherein you can also succeed, then you'll never succeed, even in the good times. So that's why you see people who, behind the Iron Curtain, were willing to risk their jobs, sometimes their lives, for their Judaism. And those same people today living in free countries are not necessarily Jewishly observant. It's fascinating, right? So it just shows you that it's actually more challenging to do the right thing in good times than to do the right thing in difficult times. That's the order in which he presents this Mishnah. First, he says, the person who can hold on to things in the difficult times, their next test will be the good times. That's actually the order. And then, if they did a good enough job in the difficult times, they will also hold on in the good times. But the other way around, the person who cannot hold it together in the good times will be devastated in the difficult times. It's really relevant information.
Would you change it and say that a person has to have like emunah? The tenacity got to do with emunah?
Okay, so it's interesting that you raise the point of emunah, because he doesn't say that, right? He says hamekayem es haTorah, person who upholds Torah, and I think it's really important to know this. The nature of emunah, if we're honest about it, is that emunah very often for many people is, in case of emergency, break glass. So, in case of emergency, break glass. Meaning to say that we all have emunah. That doesn't necessarily mean that we all live with emunah all of the time. The nature of emunah is that it can be very peripheral in our lives. It can be very powerful in a crisis, but it's not necessarily powerful on a day-by-day basis. As the Gemara uses the famous example, and I think it's one of the most fascinating psychological moments in the whole of Judaism, when the Gemara talks about the Ganav who prays for success as he breaks into the house. That is emunah. It's not very healthy emunah, but if there was no emunah, he wouldn't be davening. But if there was healthy emunah, he wouldn't be breaking in. So I think that's part of the word or the phrase he uses over here, hamekayem es haTorah. The word kiyum means something which is stable, sustainable. So it's not simply just to fall back on emunah as an emergency position. It becomes the kiyum. It's got to become something which is solid and unwavering to the point that I can uphold the Torah. In fact, one of the commentaries of the Mishnah, the Yochin, says that the word mekayim over here doesn't even mean to learn Torah. It means to support people who learn Torah. The person who can find a way to financially support those who learn Torah, even when they don't have money, that's the person who will have the schus to be able to support people who learn Torah when they are wealthy. In other words, the implication is emphasizing the word kiyum, keeping the system sustainable, whether it's your personal system or the larger system. It's a fascinating insight. So what is our objective as Jewish people? If you read what Rabbi Yonasan is saying, it's not to go through a list every single day and say, okay, I did that, I did that, I did that, and I did that. It's the kiyum, that it should be stable, that it should be unwavering, that our Yiddishkeit should be something we can absolutely rely upon. Which brings us to a very interesting observation. Who says that wealth and poverty is an issue of money? That's an assumption we make, right? But the truth is that wealth and poverty reflect other areas of our lives as well. For example, some people are talented, so they're wealthy in ability, and other people are not so wealthy in ability. Let's go back to the first example that you gave. Rabbi Akiva, his poverty at the beginning of his journey had nothing to do with his bank account. His poverty had to do with his inability to learn. If a person recognizes that I battled, and very often, let's be honest, you look around at other people and say, I wish I was like that. They just open the book and the information just sinks in and they never forget it. You know, like I remember as a kid, I used to think, I have a photographic memory, just don't have film. So
These days you don't need them.
that's right. That's what I said when I was a kid. I also looked around the room to see who didn't understand that reference. So the thing is, you look at other people, it's so much part of the human nature to compare ourselves to other people. So we're constantly doing that. We're saying, oh, look at that person. They just remember everything they learn. Look at that person. They get those knotty topics. You know, when you look at the schedule for the learning, every one of us does this. Every one of us. That one I'm not going to. Never. I'll never follow that. That's what we do, right? And that's what Rabbi Akiva felt. I'm not going to that thing called yeshiva. I'm a shepherd. 40 years old, didn't know how to read. He's an ani. He's absolutely impoverished in an intellectual sense. But he understood the concept of mekayem. This is so powerful. Mekayem is something that you do. It's not a matter of what you have. All of us have gifts to a greater or a lesser extent. This is not a question of what you have. That's not a Jewish attitude. Judaism is not a leaderboard of how talented you are. Judaism is about how hard are you working to push yourself beyond what is natural for you. You hear the inflection? Because of the lack, because of the so-called impoverished state of the person, that's why they're working to be Mekayim. That's why they feel that they have to invest, rather than to throw up their hands and say, well, woe is to me, unfortunately, I just wasn't endowed with the right talents to be able to do this. Nonsense. HaMekayim es HaTorah, you know who upholds Torah? Me'oini. The person who comes from a position of struggle, as the Gemara says elsewhere, based on the pasuk in Parashas Chukas, Adam ki Zois HaTorah, Adam ki yamus ba'oihel. Now, face value, it's saying, the following are the laws of a person who dies in a tent. Says the Gemara, what does it mean? Adam ki yamus ba'oihel. When a person kills themselves, meaning to say they push themselves beyond themselves, you kill the old you to discover a new you. In the oihel shel Torah, in the environment of Torah, zois ha-Torah. That's how you acquire Torah. That's what Rabbi Yonasan is telling us. It's not some kind of a magical promise. If you hang in there through the hard times, everything will be fine later. Because then we have a list of rabbis who never got there. They were poor for their whole lives. That's not the message. It's HaMekayem es HaTorah, the person who is truly going to uphold and fulfill Torah properly. Me'oini is a person who is willing to get beyond what they consider to be their limitations. Flip side. The person who has all of those talents, who is endowed, and we know people like this too. They are endowed with a great intellect and they easily understand what's flying, and because of that they become blasé and they don't necessarily invest or push themselves in Torah. Eventually, you know what happens? This most incredibly ironic thing happens, that they eventually run out of steam and they don't get very far in the Yiddishkeit. And I think of a particular example, a person I know. So yichus is a similar thing, except that yichus think that's where a person thinks that you can ride on the greatness of others. Here we're even saying your own greatness. Don't even ride on your own greatness. That's not sufficient. There's a great line about yichus, by the way. I don't know if you've ever heard this line. Yichus is like an onion. Have you ever heard this? The best part is beneath the ground. So, anyway, so I'll tell you a story. There was a fellow who was at school at the same time that I was in high school, and thank God in the frum schools they don't do this, but in many of the schools they do, least likely or most likely to succeed. Right? They do that kind of thing when people are at school. So Baruch Hashem, we didn't. If we had done it in our school, I'm pretty convinced we would have voted this individual least likely to succeed. For a whole variety of reasons, not least of which is that he didn't really show particular intellectual abilities. Seemed very average, maybe below average. We all finished school, we went off to various yeshivas, and so did he. And I met up with him maybe 2 years later, post-school. And the guy was unbelievable. He was quoting Gemaras. He knew the sugyas that he was learning. It was fascinating. Today, he is a Rosh Yeshiva. In school, everybody thought, now let me tell you, that is not simply a story of undiscovered talent. The diamond in the rough, as much as a story of Hamekayim es Torah me'oini. He realized that Torah is not a download. It's something that you work at, like Rabbi Akiva, the water on the stone, again and again and again. And eventually it permeates, and eventually you get to a place you could never have dreamed of. This is Rabbi Yonason's message, at least with regards to talent. But talent is not the only thing. One of the big issues that we have, cue the drum roll, welcome to the 21st century. What is our biggest, or one of our biggest issues in our minds? Time. I don't have the time. I mean, I can get in one shiur a week at the beginning of the week. On a Monday morning, I'll come and I'll do my shiur, but I don't have the time. Right? You know how much time everything takes? Do you know how much time it takes to get through all of those WhatsApps? So wealth and poverty also relates to time. Now, whether we're talking about money, or we're talking about intellectual ability, or we're talking about time, Rabbi Yonason's message applies right across the board. One of the famous things, and it's probably an axiom of Judaism, is the concept of ein ani ele beda'as ve'ein ashir ele beda'as, that the truest definition of poverty is in a person's mind, and likewise wealth. That means all of these things are all about how we see them. Even time. Now, you can't add or diminish how much time there is in the day, right? That's not possible. You get your 24-hour allocation, and that's it. But, Hamekayim es Torah me'oini, when a person recognizes that my priority is that in spite of the difficulties and challenges and the lack of time or ability, or whatever it is that I have, I am going to invest lekayim, to make my Torah stable, that oini becomes oisher. What previously was a liability turns into an asset. Now that might sound fanciful, right? How does that work? One example we've just looked at, the person who really, really, really pushes themselves to learn in an incredible fashion, eventually they totally supersede other people who may have greater talents. But we need to understand the technology. How does this work? What kind of miracle stuff is this? So I have to tell you a fascinating story that I heard. I was very privileged. I studied in yeshiva for 2 years. For 2 of the years in yeshiva, I studied in Kfar Chabad in Israel. Now, if you don't know where Kfar Chabad is, so next time you land in Ben Gurion Airport, before the plane turns around back to the terminal, jump out of the plane, jump over a few etrog trees, and then you'll be in Kfar Chabad. So at that time, the centerpiece of the yeshiva was an old chassid called Reb Mendel Futterfass. If you've come to enough shiurim of mine, you've heard his name. So Reb Mendel Futterfass spent a decade in Soviet prisons, and they almost killed him. And he had set up this underground network of yeshivas under the communists' noses in the area of Samarkand, together with a few other guys. He was a fascinating human being, incredible scholar who never let on that he was a scholar. It was fascinating. and you had to drill him, and let me tell you, we tried. You had to drill him to find the depth. He would He'd always throw out like these little stories and anecdotes or whatever. They were all profound, but he never let on that the guy was Baki Bashas, an incredible person. So on one particular occasion, Reb Mendel Futafas was in New York, and there was a rabbi, a very busy and successful communal rabbi, who had just walked out of having a personal audience with the Rebbe. So Reb Mendel goes to him and says, "No, what did you discuss?" And he was like, he had this mischievous side to him. So, you couldn't say no to him. "What did you discuss?" So the rabbi says, "I'll tell you what I discussed. I asked the Rebbe, I said, I'm so busy that I don't really have enough time to sit and learn at my own level. I give a lot of shiurim and that kind of thing, but I never really get the opportunity to learn at my own level." So Reb Mendel said to him, "So what did the Rebbe say?" So he says, the Rebbe said, "At the end of the day, when you finish everything, that's when you should sit down to learn in depth. Whatever time it is, 10, 11 p.m., doesn't matter. That's when you sit down to learn." And the Rebbe told him, in the beginning it will be difficult, but after a while it will get easier. So Reb Mendel says to him, "How did you interpret that last part that the Rebbe said?" So this is very simple. The first few weeks of trying to learn late at night will be difficult, and eventually, like anything else, it's habit forming. Eventually it'll become easier. And Mendel laughed at him. He says, "That's not what the Rebbe meant. The Rebbe meant the first few hours of the night will be difficult, and thereafter it will get easier." Ein ani and ein asher ela b'da'as. The only reality of being impoverished or empowered is in our own perception, in our own understanding. So as long as a person thinks, "I can't learn at night, that's ridiculous. It's not possible. I'm too tired, I'm too this." That's ani b'da'as. That is a self-defeating perspective. As long as a person says, "I don't have enough time," what we're really saying is, this isn't a great enough priority. So hamekayem es haTorah me'oini, when a person is willing to say, "I'm going to push myself to create a sustainable connection to the Torah that I'm learning," me'oini, in the context of the reality of what I find to be so challenging, eventually it will get easier. Me'oisha, that itself will become fine. That itself will become easier.
But if I don't understand purpose, why is it so addictive to do technology, to waste time, and take the time to make something better? It doesn't make sense, because we all know Torah and doing that is much more achieving and purposely. And you don't go through what doesn't help. But like what's the, like why is it someone so strong about that?
So this is a big question that maybe isn't specific to this Mishnah. It's a question bichlal.
It's so much not easier, but something about it. I know what the purpose is, but it's
Right.
But why does that draw me?
Perfect. So this is exactly what Rabbi Yonasan is saying, right? Rabbi Yonasan is saying, "Hamerkayem es haTorah me'oini." What does oini mean? I feel that I am poor. Now, poor is always a relative term. That's the truth. I'm poor because, so I'm poor in resources. I don't know how to stop the addictive nature, if we're honest with ourselves, the addictive nature of the lives that we live. And there are many addictive elements to our lives. We use technology as an example. It is not the only example. But there's so many things that steal our attention and, of course, our time. That's what he's telling us. Ein ani ela b'da'as, ein asher ela b'da'as. If a person believes that I am disempowered, so you're not going to get anywhere. Hamekayem es haTorah, that's where we start. Hamekayem es haTorah. I am designed, I am wired, because if Hashem tells me to do something, that means that Hashem has empowered me to do it. I am empowered to be Mekayem es haTorah. That has to be the positioning statement. Now we'll look at the practicality. May oini, if I have whichever particular weakness it is, financial distractions, time constraints, lack of talent, that is the secondary element. If I realize that I am here, lekayem es haTorah, that means that I have internally the capacity to overcome all of those obstacles. That becomes sofer lekayem me'oisher. then I realized that my kiyum of the Torah, I actually have the so-called wealth within myself. We actually have precedent for this in Tanakh. Very famous story of the woman that Elisha, remember the story with Elisha and the Shunamis, and she doesn't have, remember the story where she doesn't have enough money, and the Noisha is coming. It's a fascinating story, by the way. If you've ever studied, I don't know if you've ever learned the story, the two stories of Elisha are fascinating stories about the neshama. They're all coded stories about the neshama on a deeper level, not for now. So she hasn't got money, and the debt collectors are going to kidnap her son if she doesn't sort it out. Who, by the way, is Habakkuk, right? So, what am I going to do? So he says to her, what do you have in the house? What does she have in the house? Ki'im asuch shamen. Little jug of oil. Precursor to the Hanukkah story, right? So what does he tell her? Go to the neighbors, borrow as many kalim, as many containers of any shape, size, or form as you can, and pour the oil. Kalim reikim al tamiti. Don't diminish, don't reduce the amount of empty vessels that you have. And what's the story? She pours out of this little thing of oil, and it keeps pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. And when does the oil run out? When there are no more kalim. No more vessels. It's an incredibly important story for us. What do you think? The Tanakh's telling us the show-off story. Do you know how great Elisha was? He could do miracles. The Tanakh doesn't do that. It's not like some kind of a hall of fame of the great miracle makers of Judaism. It's not even a book of history. The Torah throughout Tanakh is a book of lessons. The lesson is, as long as we create the keli, the environment, which is all we can do, that means to put in our effort, Hashem will continue to allow the oil to flow. HaMekayim es haTorah me'oini. The person who says, I have nothing. I don't have the resources, I don't have the wisdom, I don't have the time, I don't have the orientation, whatever particular thing it is. But I'm going to be mekayim, I'm going to create structures. Hashem will fill that space with success. Or as we already learned previously, our job is not to complete the mission. But we don't have the freedom or the luxury to desist from doing it. Our job is to work, to try. Once we do, then Hashem fills the space. But it gets better than that. Much better than that. Because in the parasha we just read this Shabbos, you know how the parasha is this Shabbos, right? It's the big disappointment. It was so exciting. There was the drama of the slavery in Egypt, the amazing miracles of the plagues, the Exodus, the splitting the sea, the man, the giving of the Torah. It's like, whoa, this is so exciting. And then they tell you, this is what you do with a slave, and you pierce the ear after 6 years. What? What's going on up here? What are you talking about? So I feel like, have you ever seen those on the highways when there's a steep downhill? They've got those big sand beds for the trucks, in case the truck can't stop. They go and you just like sink into the sand. I feel like that's what happens to people in Mishpatim. We're going gung-ho, voracious, and the first parasha was all exciting. You get to Mishpatim, it's like, we get stuck. And because of that, we don't often get to the end of the parasha in Mishpatim, because there's so much to wade through in all these. So you get to the end of the parasha, and Hashem says this, that if you do what I say, so he gives a whole lot of promises of things that are going to happen. And it's very interesting how it works, because the promises start right at the end of an aliyah, at the end of the 5th aliyah, and then they begin like almost as a separate thing in the 6th aliyah. And you know what he says over there? That again, what's the intro? The intro is Vavadetem. Vavadetem means you're going to work. What do you think? It's a download? No, you're going to work. Vavadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. It's going to be hard. You know why it's going to be hard? Because you feel, I'm an oni. I'm disempowered. So you're going to work at this. What does Hashem promise? Lo yitiyeh mishakela v'akora b'artzecha. There will not be any miscarriage or stillborn or any infertility in your land. Es mispar yamecha amalei. I will fill the amount of your days. What's Hashem telling us? So, ein mikra yotzim midei pshuto. You have to read things at face value. It's a promise for long life and for children. But it's layered like everything else in the Torah. Lo yisiyem mishakela v'akara be'artzecha. The most frustrating thing in the world is when you try to work in your Yiddishkeit and it doesn't go anywhere. And you feel like that was a miscarriage. It didn't produce life. It died. So what does Hashem say? V'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem. When you work, I guarantee you, lo yitiyeh mishakela v'akara. It won't be left infertile. It won't be left barren. Your efforts will produce results. Hamekayim es haTorah me'oini. The person who works hard when it's difficult for them, because they are really an oni in one of the different areas of potential poverty: talent, time, perspective, or cash in the bank. Hashem says it's not going to go empty-handed. But more than that, es mispar yomecha amalei. The amount of your days I will, how do you translate it? Fill. Fill your days? When do you fill something? When it's empty. When it's lacking. Es mispar yomecha amalei, Hashem says, from the moment that you really work hard, soifo lekaimo me oisher, at the end I will fill in even the old time, the past. Only Hashem could do that. We can't do that. We can't turn the clock back. But Hashem can. He's beyond time and space. Es mispar yomecha, the amount of days that you should have worked, where you were still a poor person, you were not working. Amalei, I will fill those days. Soifcha, at the end, lekaima, all of your efforts, right retroactively back, will be me'osher, will be full and wealthy and amazing. And that's just such an encouraging thought for us. Because so often in our lives, we only find out the right information a few years down the line. And then you turn back and say, well, what about what was happening before? That's not our concern. Our concern is to invest, lekayim es haTorah, from here going forward, and Hashem will fill in the gaps if we are committed as we should be. That is an encouraging thought to take with us.